In the forgotten coastal town of Millbrook, where salt air carries both memories and dreams, Elias Rayner stands at his kitchen window, watching the morning fog roll in from the harbour. His weathered hands wrap around a chipped coffee mug, the same one his late wife Sarah used to fill each dawn before her shift at the hospital. The silence feels heavier these days, broken only by his 12-year-old son, Tommy's gentle breathing from the next room. Elias has built his life on simple principles: work hard, protect family, help others when you can. Yesterday, those principles cost him everything. One act of heroism on a rain-soaked highway changed the trajectory of 2 lives forever. Sometimes doing the right thing comes with a price that threatens to break you. But what happens when the person you saved turns out to hold the key to rebuilding everything you've lost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning ritual had become sacred to Elias Rayner. Every day at 6:15, he would stand in that same spot by the kitchen window, holding Sarah's mug, watching the harbour emerge from its nightly shroud of mist. The ceramic was worn smooth, where his thumb naturally rested. A small chip on the rim that Sarah had always claimed made it pour better. She'd been gone 3 years now, but the mug remained his anchor to quieter mornings when her laughter would fill the spaces between. The sound of waves and seagulls. Millbrook stretched below him, like a watercolor painting left too long in the sun, its edges softened by time and neglect. The harbour that once bustled with fishing boats and tourist charters now hosted more rust than commerce. Half the storefronts along Harbour Street wore "For Lease" signs like badges of surrender, their windows reflecting the skeletal remains of better days. The town's population had dwindled from 8,000 to barely 3,000 over the past decade, each family that left taking with them a piece of the community's soul. But for all its struggles, Millbrook retained a stubborn dignity. The lighthouse still operated, its beam sweeping across the Atlantic each night with mechanical faithfulness. The elementary school still rang its bell each morning, though the sound echoed through emptier streets than it once had. And Rayner's Auto Repair still opened its doors 6 days a week, though the customers grew fewer and the bills grew larger with each passing month. Elias set the mug down carefully and moved to the refrigerator, where Tommy's honor roll certificate hung beneath a magnet shaped like a lobster, a tourist shop remnant from their last family vacation to Bar Harbor. The certificate, with its gold-embossed seal and Tommy's careful signature, represented everything Elias was fighting for. His son's intelligence shone like a beacon in their modest home, straight A's in every subject, already talking about college and engineering programs that seemed impossibly far from their current reality. The boy stirred in his room, a soft rustling of sheets that meant he'd be awake soon. At 12, Tommy had inherited his mother's curiosity and his father's steady temperament, but he'd also developed a premature understanding of their financial constraints. He never asked for the expensive sneakers his classmates wore or complained when dinner was mac and cheese for the 3rd time in a week. Instead, he'd started a small collection of drop change found around town, proudly announcing each discovery as if he'd struck gold. Elias moved through the house with practiced quiet, preparing for another day that would demand more than it gave. The hardwood floors creaked in familiar places, the 3rd step of the staircase, the floorboard just inside the living room, the spot near the front door where Sarah used to kick off her nursing shoes. These sounds had once annoyed him, but now they provided a comforting soundtrack to his solitary mornings. Their home was small but sturdy, a 2-bedroom Cape Cod that Sarah had fallen in love with the moment they'd driven past it 15 years ago. She'd been pregnant with Tommy then, her hand resting on her growing belly as she pointed excitedly at the wraparound porch and the ancient oak tree in the front yard. They'd stretched financially to make the down payment, but it had been worth every sacrifice. The house had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, its foundations solid even as the world around it shifted. The kitchen counter held the remnants of last night's homework session, Tommy's math textbook still open, to a page of algebraic equations, his pencil resting in the crease between pages. The boy had a gift for numbers that reminded Elias of Sarah's analytical mind. She'd been the one who balanced their checkbook, who calculated tips with mathematical precision, who could figure out exactly how much paint they needed for any room. In the house, without measuring twice. Outside, the harbour was beginning to stir. Old Pete Morrison would be starting his lobster boat soon, the engine's familiar rumble carrying across the water. Pete had been offering to buy Elias a drink and share stories about the old days, when Millbrook's fishing fleet numbered in the dozens rather than the handful that remained. But Elias rarely had time for such luxuries, not when every evening was consumed with helping Tommy with homework, managing household finances, and maintaining the delicate balance that kept their small family unit functioning. The phone rang, jarring in the morning stillness. Elias glanced at the clock. 7:30 was early for business calls, but lately he'd been getting more emergency requests as other repair shops in the area closed their doors. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the professional warmth that had earned him a loyal customer base despite the town's economic struggles. Rayner's Auto Repair, this is Elias. Elias, thank God you're there. The voice belonged to Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who drove a 20-year-old Buick with the care of someone handling a family heirloom. My car won't start and I have a doctor's appointment in Bangor at 9:15. I know it's early, but I'll be right there, Mrs. Henderson. Don't worry about the appointment. This was the rhythm of his life, responding to the needs of neighbors who had become extended family, fixing problems with patience and skill, charging fair prices even when it meant his own bills would have to wait. His reputation in Millbrook was built on reliability and compassion, qualities that had kept his business afloat when flashier competitors had folded. Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his dark hair sticking up at impossible angles, wearing the Red Sox pajama set that had been a Christmas gift from his aunt in Boston. At 12, he was all knees and elbows, growing so fast that Elias had to buy new clothes every few months. But the boy's eyes held a wisdom that seemed borrowed from someone much older, a quality that had emerged after his mother's death and never quite faded. "Morning, Dad. Emergency call?" "Mrs. Henderson's car. Want to come with me before school?" Tommy nodded eagerly. These morning adventures had become their tradition, a way of spending time together while teaching the boy practical skills. Sarah had always insisted that Tommy should understand how things worked, from car engines to household appliances. "Knowledge is power," she'd say, "and power is freedom." They drove through Millbrook's quiet streets in Elias's pickup truck, past the Methodist church where Sarah's memorial service had been held, past the elementary school where Tommy would soon transition to the regional middle school, past the small cemetery where Sarah's headstone bore a simple inscription, "Beloved wife and mother, she made everything better." Mrs. Henderson lived in a Victorian house that had seen better decades, its paint faded, but its gardens still meticulously maintained. She met them at the door, wearing a floral dress and an expression of grateful relief. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Elias. This old car has been my companion for so many years." The diagnosis was simple, a corroded battery terminal, easily cleaned and reconnected. As Elias worked, Tommy asked questions about electrical systems and chemical reactions, his curiosity as bright as his mother's had been. Mrs. Henderson watched them with the fond expression of someone who remembered when families worked together, when children learned by observing and participating rather than staring at screens. "Your boy's going to be something special," she told Elias as he finished the repair. "He already is," Elias replied, ruffling Tommy's hair. "He already is." The morning continued with its familiar patterns, dropping Tommy at school, opening the garage, beginning the day's work on a succession of vehicles that represented the transportation lifelines of his neighbors. Each repair was a small act of service, a way of keeping the community connected and mobile. Elias took pride in the work, in the problem-solving and the satisfaction of returning someone's car to reliable operation. But, as he worked beneath the hood of a rusted Ford pickup, his mind kept returning to the growing stack of bills on his kitchen table, to the college brochures Tommy had started collecting, to the dreams that seemed to grow more expensive each year. The balance between providing for his son and maintaining their current lifestyle was becoming increasingly precarious, and Elias knew that something would have to change soon. He just hadn't expected that change to arrive in the form of a storm-lashed highway and a woman trapped in a burning car. The storm arrived with the fury of something personal, as if the Atlantic had nursed a grudge against the Maine coast all summer and finally decided to settle the score. By 7 in the evening, rain hammered against the garage windows with enough force to make the glass shiver, and the wind howled through the harbor with a voice that seemed to carry warnings from deeper waters. Elias had planned to close early, but Jim Carver's Chevrolet sat in the bay with its transmission half assembled, and the man needed his truck for work the next morning. Jim drove long-haul routes to support his family, and a day without his truck meant a day without pay. So Elias worked by the overhead lights while the storm raged outside, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years learning the language of engines and gears. The transmission case was older than Tommy, its metal worn smooth by decades of use, but Elias had seen worse. He believed in the dignity of keeping things running, of extending the useful life of machines that had served their owners faithfully. There was something almost sacred about taking apart a complex mechanism, understanding its purpose, and putting it back together better than before. His phone buzzed against the workbench, a text from Tommy, who was spending the evening at his friend Marcus's house working on a science project. "Storm's getting crazy. You okay at the garage?" Elias smiled at his son's concern and typed back with grease-stained fingers. "All good here. Home by 9. Love you." The work required focus, each part cleaned and inspected before reassembly. The storm provided an oddly comforting backdrop, its intensity somehow matching the concentration needed to solve mechanical puzzles. This was where Elias felt most centered, in the space between problem and solution, where patience and knowledge converged to create something useful. At 8:45, just as he was torquing the final bolts, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but emergency calls often came from phones he'd never seen before. Rayner's Auto Repair. Oh, thank God someone answered. The voice was female, stressed, speaking over what sounded like heavy rain. "My car broke down on Route 1, about 10 miles north of Millbrook. I'm completely stranded, and this storm—" "What kind of car?" Elias was already reaching for his keys and rain jacket. "It's a BMW, but I don't know the model. The engine just stopped, and now it won't start at all. I tried calling ALA, but they said it could be hours before. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Stay in the car with the hazards on. What's your name?" "Claire. Claire Johnson. And thank you so much. I'll pay whatever—" "Don't worry about that now. Just stay safe." Elias locked the garage and climbed into his pickup, the storm immediately announcing its intentions by soaking him in the few seconds it took to get from the door to the cab. The windshield wipers struggled against the deluge, and the normally familiar roads had become rivers of flowing water that reflected his headlights in strange, disorienting patterns. Route 1 stretched north through a landscape that seemed determined to wash itself clean. Trees bent at impossible angles, their branches whipping back and forth like arms conducting a violent symphony. Power lines sagged under the weight of the storm, and several times Elias had to navigate around fallen branches that blocked portions of the road. He found the BMW at mile marker 47, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain like a distress signal from a sinking ship. The car was pulled as far off the road as possible, but the narrow shoulder meant it was still dangerously close to traffic. Elias parked behind it and ran through the downpour to the driver's side window. The woman inside looked to be in her 30s, well-dressed despite her obvious distress, with dark hair that had been carefully styled before the storm turned it into damp strands around her face. She rolled down the window just enough to speak. "Are you from the garage?" Elias. "Rayner, let me take a look under the hood." The BMW was a high-end model, its engine bay filled with the kind of sophisticated electronics that made Elias grateful for the continuing education courses he'd taken over the years. He traced the problem quickly: a catastrophic failure in the fuel injection system, the kind of repair that would require parts he didn't carry and expertise that would cost more than many people made in a month. He returned to the woman's window, rain streaming down his face. "I'm afraid it's not something I can fix tonight. The fuel system's failed, and it's going to need specialized parts. I can tow you back to town, get you somewhere warm and dry." Relief flooded her features. "Yes, please. I'll pay for a hotel room, whatever you recommend." As Elias prepared his truck for towing, he noticed something odd about the situation. The BMW's license plates were from out of state, but the woman seemed to know exactly where she was, had called specifically for help in Millbrook rather than the larger towns to the north or south. There was something about her that suggested she was accustomed to being in control, to having solutions readily available, and her current helplessness seemed to surprise her as much as it concerned her. The tow back to town was treacherous, the combined weight of both vehicles making his truck slide on the wet pavement more than once. The woman, Claire, followed in her car's headlights through his rearview mirror, a constant reminder of the responsibility he'd accepted by agreeing to help. They made it to the garage parking lot just as a particularly violent gust of wind sent a trash can tumbling across Harbour Street. Elias helped Claire from her car to his truck's passenger seat, noting that her clothes were expensive but practical, her shoes designed for walking rather than fashion. "There's a bed and breakfast about 2 miles from here," he said as they drove through the storm-darkened streets. "Mrs. Patterson runs it, and she's good people. Clean rooms, warm food, reasonable prices." "That sounds perfect." They were halfway to the bed and breakfast when Elias saw the glow on the horizon. At first, he thought it might be lightning, but the light was too steady, too orange. Then he smelled the smoke carried on the wind even through the truck's closed windows. "That's a fire," Claire said, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. As they crested the hill on Elm Street, the scene revealed itself with horrifying clarity. A large black sedan, a limousine, had somehow left the road and struck the concrete barrier of the small bridge that crossed Miller's Creek. The vehicle was on its side, partially submerged in the swollen creek, and flames were beginning to emerge from the engine compartment. Elias pulled over immediately, his emergency training from his volunteer firefighter days taking over. "Stay in the truck," he told Claire, but she was already opening her door. "There might be someone in there," she said. The limousine was expensive, the kind of vehicle that typically carried important passengers. As they approached, Elias could see movement inside. Someone was trapped in the overturned car, and the rising water was making escape impossible. The driver's compartment was already partially flooded, but there was still air in the passenger area. Without hesitation, Elias waded into the creek, the current immediately trying to knock him off his feet. The water was shockingly cold and rising quickly, fed by the storm runoff from the surrounding hills. The limousine's rear window had been shattered in the crash, providing an opening just large enough for rescue. Inside, he found an unconscious woman, elegantly dressed, her dark hair floating in the rising water. She appeared to be in her 50s, with the kind of refined features that suggested wealth and sophistication. A gold locket had come loose from around her neck and floated beside her, its chain tangled in her hair. The flames were spreading now, moving from the engine toward the passenger compartment with hungry efficiency. Elias had minutes, maybe less, before the entire vehicle would be consumed. He worked quickly to free the woman, lifting her carefully through the shattered window. As the current threatened to sweep them both downstream, Claire was waiting on the bank, her phone already dialing emergency services. Together, they carried the unconscious woman to higher ground, where Elias began CPR while Claire spoke to the dispatcher. The woman coughed up creek water and opened her eyes just as the limousine exploded behind them, sending a column of flame and smoke into the storm-darkened sky. "Don't try to move," Elias told her gently. "Help is coming." She looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold both gratitude and surprise, as if she wasn't accustomed to strangers risking their lives for her. Benefit. Her lips moved, but her voice was too weak to carry over the storm. The paramedics arrived within minutes, followed by the fire department and police. As they worked to stabilize the woman, Elias noticed that Claire had disappeared. The BMW was gone from the garage parking lot, and when he asked the police about her, they seemed confused. "What woman?" Officer Martinez asked. "The report we got was that you were alone when you called in the accident." Elias started to explain, but then stopped. The storm, the adrenaline, the confusion of the rescue. Perhaps he had imagined Claire, or perhaps she had simply chosen not to get involved with the police investigation. Either way, the important thing was that the woman from the limousine was alive. As he drove home through the gradually diminishing storm, Elias's phone buzzed with a text from Jim Carver. "Heard about the rescue on the police scanner. Don't worry. About my truck, it'll keep another day. You're a hero, man." But Elias didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had done what needed to be done, who had made the only choice that his conscience would allow. He'd learned long ago that life presented moments where you either acted or lived with regret, where the distance between right and wrong was measured not in thought, but in action. What he didn't know, as he pulled into his driveway and saw Tommy's worried face in the living room window, was that his decision to abandon Jim Carver's truck had been witnessed by someone who would use it against him. He didn't know that the woman he'd saved was someone whose rescue would change the trajectory of his life in ways he couldn't imagine. All he knew was that he'd helped someone in need, and that tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The storm was passing, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. The morning after the storm dawned, with the cruel brightness that often follows nature's tantrums, as if the sky were apologizing for its previous violence with an abundance of sunshine. Elias woke to the sound of Tommy moving around the kitchen, the familiar clink of cereal bowl against spoon, providing a comforting counterpoint to the churning in his stomach. He'd slept poorly, replaying the events of the previous evening in fragments that felt both vivid and dreamlike. The woman's face as she opened her eyes beside the burning limousine, the mysterious Claire who had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed, the weight of another person's life in his arms as he carried her from the wreckage. But more pressing than these memories was the reality waiting for him at the garage. He'd left Jim Carver's truck half-repaired, abandoning a paying customer to rescue a stranger. In the clear light of morning, that decision felt both inevitable and potentially catastrophic. Tommy looked up from his cereal as Elias entered the kitchen, his young face bright with admiration. "Dad, everyone's talking about what you did last night." Marcus's mom called it heroic. Elias poured coffee into Sarah's mug, the familiar ritual providing a moment of stability in what promised to be a difficult day. "Sometimes you just do what needs doing, son. It's not about being heroic, but you saved someone's life and left someone else's truck in pieces." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and he saw Tommy's expression falter slightly. "I'm sorry, buddy. It's just complicated sometimes doing the right thing." Tommy nodded with the serious expression of a child trying to understand adult complexities. "Will Mr. Carver be mad?" "Probably. And he'd have every right to be." They finished breakfast in contemplative silence, Tommy sensing his father's mood and respecting it with the emotional intelligence he'd developed since his mother's death. As they prepared to leave for school and work, Tommy paused at the front door. "Dad, even if Mr. Carver's mad, you still did the right thing. Mom would have been proud." The simple wisdom of children Elias reflected as he drove toward the garage, often cut straight to the heart of matters that adults complicated with overthinking. Sarah would have been proud. She'd always believed that when faced with a choice between helping and not helping, the only acceptable option was to help. The garage looked different in the morning light, somehow smaller and more vulnerable than it had seemed the night before. Jim Carver's Chevrolet sat exactly where Elias had left it, its transmission case open like a patient on an operating table. The sight of it sent a spike of anxiety through his chest. His phone rang before he could even unlock the front door. Rayner's. Auto repair. Elias, this is Jim. The voice was tight with controlled anger. I came by this morning expecting to pick up my truck. Jim, I can explain. I heard about your rescue mission. Very noble. But I've got a delivery run to Boston that I can't make now, which means I lose a day's pay and possibly a customer. My family eats on what that truck earns. The words hit like physical blows. Elias had known this conversation was coming, but hearing the frustration and financial stress in Jim's voice made it worse than he'd anticipated. I can have it finished by noon, Elias offered, though he knew the damage was already done. Noon. Doesn't help me with the 7 a.m. pickup I missed. Look, Elias, I like you. We all do. But I can't afford to work with someone who might abandon my repair halfway through for any reason, no matter how good that reason is. The line went dead. Elias stood in his empty garage, holding the phone and feeling the first crack in the foundation of his livelihood. Jim Carver had been a regular customer for 8 years, reliable work that paid well and on time. More importantly, Jim talked to other drivers, and word would spread quickly through the tight-knit community of independent truckers who formed a significant portion of Elias's customer base. He threw himself into completing the transmission repair, working with the kind of focused intensity that comes from needing to prove something to himself. The familiar rhythm of mechanical work provided temporary refuge from the larger implications of the morning's conversation. Every bolt torqued to specification, every connection checked and double-checked, every fluid level verified. He would finish this job perfectly, even if it was too late to matter. By 11:30, the Chevrolet was purring like it had rolled off the assembly line. Elias called Jim to report the completion, but the call went straight to voicemail. He left a message, knowing it was mostly for his own conscience. The rest of the morning crawled by with ominous quiet. No emergency calls, no walk-in customers, just the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the empty bays. Elias tried to lose himself in routine maintenance tasks, but his mind kept returning to the stack of bills on his kitchen table, to Tommy's college fund that had been growing at a depressingly slow pace, to the precarious balance that kept their small family afloat. Around 1 o'clock, Martha Klein from the hardware store stopped by with what she claimed was a routine question about her car's air conditioning, but Elias could see the curiosity in her eyes. Martha served as Millbrook's unofficial information exchange, and her visit meant the whole town would soon know about his professional difficulties. Heard you had some excitement last night, she said, settling herself against his workbench with the air of someone prepared for a long conversation. Just helped someone who needed it. That's what we heard. Also heard Jim Carver wasn't too pleased about his truck. Elias continued working on the alternator he'd been rebuilding, not trusting himself to respond diplomatically. Martha had a gift for extracting information through strategic silence, and he wasn't going to provide her with ammunition for the town's gossip network. People are saying the woman you saved was somebody important. Expensive car, designer clothes, that sort of thing. I wouldn't know about that. Of course, there's also talk about whether it's right for a businessman to abandon paying customers, even for good reasons. Folks are divided on it. There it was, the slow poison of small-town judgment beginning to spread through the community. Elias had lived in Millbrook long enough to understand how these things worked. A few strategic conversations, a careful emphasis on certain details, and public opinion could shift dramatically. After Martha left, Elias called 3 other garages in the surrounding towns, testing the waters for possible employment. The first two weren't hiring. The third, owned by a man named Rodriguez, who had competed with Elias for customers over the years, was bluntly honest. "I heard about last night, Elias. Can't say I wouldn't have done the same thing, but I also can't say I'd trust an employee who might disappear in the middle of a job." Nothing personal. As the afternoon wore on, the reality of his situation began to crystallize. He had perhaps 2 months of savings, enough to cover basic expenses, but not the mortgage payment that was due in 3 weeks. Tommy's school expenses. For the fall were approaching, and the boy would need new clothes soon. Another growth spurt had left most of his wardrobe fitting like he'd borrowed it from a younger cousin. At 4 o'clock, as he was closing up for the day, a car pulled into his lot. For a moment, his heart lifted with the hope of a customer, but his optimism faded when he recognized the vehicle. It belonged to Dave Patterson, the man who owned the garage where Elias had worked as a young mechanic before opening his own shop. Dave emerged from his car with the careful movements of someone whose body had absorbed decades of physical labor. He was in his 70s now, his hands permanently stained with grease despite retirement, his back curved from years of bending over engine bays. "Heard you had a rough day," Dave said without preamble. "News travels fast." "Always has in this." "And town. Mind if we talk?" They sat on the bench outside the garage office, the same bench where Elias used to eat lunch during his apprenticeship 20 years earlier. Dave had been more than a boss then. He'd been a mentor, teaching not just the technical aspects of auto repair, but the business principles that had allowed Elias to eventually strike out on his own. "I won't insult you by asking if you do it again," Dave said finally. "We both know you would. Question is, what are you going to do now? Keep working." "Hope people remember that I've been reliable for 15 years. They will, most of them. But business is about confidence, and confidence is fragile. You know that." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the harbor, where a few lobster boats were returning from their daily runs. The afternoon light painted the water in shades of gold and blue, and for a moment Elias could remember why he'd chosen to build his life in this place, despite its economic challenges. "You still got that pride problem I tried to cure you of." "When you were 25, Dave observed. "What do you mean?" "Means you'd rather starve than ask for help. Means you'll work yourself into the ground before admitting you might need support." Sarah used to worry about that. The mention of his wife's name sent a familiar ache through Elias's chest. Sarah had indeed worried about his tendency toward self-reliance, his reluctance to burden others with his problems. "What would you suggest?" "Start with not carrying this alone. Talk to Tommy, not about the details, but about the fact that things might be changing. That boy's stronger than you think, and he deserves to know what's happening." Dave stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and Elias, "Don't make any desperate decisions. Sometimes the storm passes quicker than you expect." As Dave drove away, Elias remained on the bench, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Tomorrow he would have to face whatever consequences his heroic act had generated. Tonight, he would have to find a way to explain to his son that their carefully constructed life might be about to change in ways neither of them could control. The sound of the school bus announced Tommy's return, and Elias stood to meet him. Some conversations couldn't be postponed, no matter how much you dreaded having them. The conversation with Tommy that evening proved both easier and harder than Elias had anticipated. They sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the same worn oak surface where Sarah had once helped Tommy with his first homework assignments, where family decisions had been made and dreams discussed. "Dad, you look worried," Tommy said, his fork pushing around the remnants of their spaghetti dinner. At 12, he had developed an uncanny ability to read his father's moods, a skill born from the necessity of having only one parent left to interpret the world's complexities. "We need to talk about some changes that might be coming," Elias began, choosing his words carefully. "What I did last night, helping that woman, was the right thing to do, but it also caused some problems with my work." Tommy set down his fork. and gave his father the kind of focused attention that reminded Elias painfully of Sarah. "Are we in trouble? We're going to be fine. But we might need to make some adjustments, maybe tighten our belts a little more than usual, like when Mom was sick." The question hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of memories neither wanted to revisit but couldn't ignore. During Sarah's final months, when medical bills had consumed their savings and Elias had worked double shifts to keep them afloat, they'd learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed. "Something like that, yes. But this is different. This is temporary." Tommy nodded with a solemnity that seemed borrowed from someone much older. "I can get a paper route. Marcus makes $40 a week delivering the Harbor Gazette." The offer broke Elias's heart a little. His 12-year-old son, already thinking like a partner in their family's survival, already prepared to sacrifice his childhood to ease his father's burden. "That's generous, buddy, but your job is school. My job is taking care of us." They spent the evening reviewing their household budget together, a practice Sarah had established when Tommy was old enough to understand money. It was a family tradition born from transparency rather than necessity, designed to teach responsibility and planning. Tonight, it served a more urgent purpose. "We can skip the cable TV," Tommy suggested, studying the list of monthly expenses. "I mostly watch stuff on the library computers anyway. And I can take my lunch to work instead of buying sandwiches at Miller's Deli," Elias added, though the thought of giving up his occasional midday conversations with the deli's owner felt like losing another small piece of normalcy. By bedtime, they had identified several areas where expenses could be reduced, at least temporarily. It wasn't enough to solve their larger problems, but it provided the illusion of control, the sense that they were taking action rather than simply waiting for circumstances to improve. Elias lay awake that night, listening to the familiar sounds of their house settling into darkness, the refrigerator's gentle hum, the tick of the grandfather clock Sarah had inherited from her mother, the distant sound of waves against the harbor rocks. These sounds had once represented security and continuity. Now they seemed to mock his inability to guarantee his family's future. He was still awake at 6:15 the next morning when the first helicopter appeared. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, rhythmic chopping that grew louder with each passing second. Elias moved to the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, and watched in bewilderment as a sleek black aircraft descended toward his neighborhood. It was followed by a second helicopter, then a third, their precision formation suggesting military training or corporate efficiency. The lead helicopter settled onto the small park across from his house, its rotor wash sending autumn leaves swirling in violent spirals. The other two machines hovered overhead like mechanical guardians, their presence transforming the quiet residential street into something from a movie. Tommy appeared beside him in his pajamas, eyes wide with excitement and confusion. "Dad, what's happening?" "I have no idea." The helicopter's door opened, and several figures emerged, men in dark suits who moved with the purposeful stride of people accustomed to being in charge. They were followed by a woman Elias recognized immediately, despite the expensive clothes and the confident bearing that seemed so different from the helpless victim he'd pulled from a burning car 2 nights earlier. It was the woman from the limousine. She walked across the street toward his house with the measured pace of someone who had thought carefully about this moment. Her dark hair was perfectly styled now, and she wore a tailored coat that probably cost more than Elias made in a month. But her eyes, those were the same eyes that had looked at him with gratitude and surprise as the flames consumed her vehicle. "Dad," Tommy whispered, "is that the lady you saved?" Before Elias could answer, the doorbell rang. The sound seemed impossibly normal given the circumstances, as if someone delivering mail or asking directions had arrived with a helicopter escort. Elias opened the door to find the woman standing on his porch, flanked by 2 of the suited men. Up close, she looked both more formidable and more vulnerable than she had in the storm's chaos. There was an unmistakable air of authority about her, but also something uncertain, as if she wasn't quite sure how to proceed. "Mr. Rayner," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor despite her composed appearance. "I'm Vivienne Aldridge. I believe we met under rather dramatic circumstances." The name meant nothing to Elias, but the way she said it suggested it should. "Please come in, though I have to admit I wasn't expecting helicopters." She smiled, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "I'm afraid I tend to travel with rather more security than most people. Occupational hazard." As they settled in his living room, Elias became acutely aware of the contrast between his modest surroundings and the obvious wealth represented by his unexpected guest. The coffee table still held Tommy's homework from the night before, and Sarah's knitting basket sat in its familiar corner, untouched since her death, but somehow still essential to the room's character. "I wanted to thank you properly," Vivienne continued, "for what you did. The doctors tell me I would have died if you hadn't acted so quickly. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No, Mr. Rayner, they wouldn't have. Most people would have called 911 and waited for professionals. You risked your own life to save a complete stranger." Tommy, who had been hovering in the doorway, stepped forward with the curiosity that had always defined him. "Are you really rich?" "Tommy," Elias said sharply, but Vivienne laughed. "It's a fair question." "Yes, I suppose I am. Does that seem strange to you?" "A little. Dad says rich people usually don't end up in burning cars." "Your father is a wise man, and you're right. This was a very unusual situation for me." She turned her attention back to Elias, her expression growing more serious. "I've learned about the professional difficulties my rescue has caused you. That's unacceptable. It's not your fault. I made a choice. A choice that cost you customers and income. A choice made to save my life." She leaned forward slightly, her intensity suddenly visible. "Mr. Rayner, I didn't accumulate wealth by ignoring my debts. I owe you more than gratitude." From her briefcase, she withdrew a manila folder and set it on the coffee table. "I've done some research on Millbrook. This town has enormous potential. A skilled workforce, a beautiful location, proximity to major markets, but it's been abandoned by the kind of investment that could revitalize it." Elias picked up the folder, finding it filled with charts, demographic studies, and economic projections that painted a picture of Millbrook's decline and potential recovery. The data was comprehensive and professionally prepared, the kind of analysis that represented significant time and expense. "I want to build something here," Vivienne continued. "A technology incubation center, a place where entrepreneurs and innovators can develop projects that benefit local communities. It's a model I've been considering for several locations, but Millbrook has something the others don't." "What's that?" "You, someone who understands this place, who has the trust of the community, who can bridge the gap between outside investment and local needs." The proposal was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. According to the documents, Vivienne was offering to invest $50 million in a facility that would bring hundreds of jobs to the area, create educational opportunities for young people, and establish Millbrook as a center for innovative technology development. "This is incredibly generous," Elias said carefully, "but I'm not qualified to manage something like this. I fix cars. You solve problems. You understand how things work and how to make them work better. You have the respect of your neighbors and a reputation for integrity. Those qualifications matter more than any business degree." Tommy, who had been studying the charts with the same intensity he brought to his math homework, looked up with shining eyes. "Dad, this could save the whole town." It could indeed, Elias realized, but it could also be the kind of opportunity that seemed too good to be true, the kind that wealthy people offered in moments of gratitude and later regretted. In the cold light of financial reality. "Why?" he asked simply. Vivienne was quiet for a long moment, her composed facade slipping slightly. Because for the first time in years, someone acted without expecting anything in return. Because you reminded me that there are still people in the world who choose to help rather than exploit. Because I've spent so much of my life surrounded by people who want something from me that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be helped by someone who wanted nothing. The vulnerability in her voice was unmistakable, and Elias found himself reconsidering his initial skepticism. This wasn't just about gratitude or guilt. It was about something deeper, a connection forged in crisis and strengthened by recognition of shared values. "I'll need time to think about this," he said. "Of course, but Mr. Rayner." She stood, smoothing her coat with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Please don't let pride prevent you from considering something that could benefit not just your family, but this entire community. Sometimes accepting help is the most generous thing you can do." As the helicopters lifted off from the park, returning the neighborhood to its normal quiet, Elias and Tommy stood at their window, watching them disappear into the distance. The manila folder lay open on the coffee table, its contents representing possibilities neither of them had imagined when they'd woken that morning. "Dad," Tommy said quietly, "what are you going to do?" It was, Elias realized, exactly the right question. What was he going to do with an opportunity that seemed to offer everything they needed, but demanded a leap of faith that terrified him? How did you evaluate the motives of someone whose world was so different from your own? And how did you balance skepticism with the possibility that sometimes genuine goodness existed even in the most unlikely circumstances? "I'm going to think very carefully," he told his son, "and then I'm going to make the best decision I can." Outside, Millbrook continued its daily rhythms, unaware that its future might have just changed forever. The weight of Sarah's wedding ring had never felt heavier than it did the morning after Vivian's visit. Elias turned it absently on his finger as he stood in his garage, surrounded by the familiar tools and half-finished projects that had once represented security and purpose. Now they seemed like artifacts from a simpler time, when his biggest concerns were transmission repairs and monthly bills, rather than $50 million investments and the future of an entire town. Tommy had gone to school that morning with the excitement of someone harboring a magnificent secret. His son's enthusiasm was both infectious and terrifying. The boy saw only the potential for adventure and positive change, unburdened by the adult understanding of how dramatically things could go wrong when you trusted strangers with life-altering decisions. The manila folder sat on his workbench where he'd placed it the night before, its contents seeming to multiply in importance with each passing hour. Elias had read through the proposal 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of complexity and opportunity. Vivian Aldridge wasn't just offering charity disguised as business. She was proposing a genuine partnership that could transform Millbrook from a dying coastal town into something unprecedented. But who was Vivian Aldridge, really? The question had kept him awake most of the night, and this morning he decided to find some answers. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a Victorian building that had once housed the town's most prosperous bank. Its reading room still dominated by the massive oak table where loan applications had been reviewed during better economic times. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, greeted Elias with the gentle smile of someone who had watched him grow from a boy checking out adventure novels to a man, researching practical subjects like small business management and child psychology. "Research project?" she asked, noting the intensity in his expression. "Something like that. I need to learn about someone, and I'm not sure where to start." Mrs. Chen led him to one of the library's 3 public computers, its screen flickering to life with the patient hum of technology that had been state-of-the-art a decade earlier. "What's the name?" "Vivian Aldridge." The search results were immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of articles, business profiles, and news stories painted a picture of a woman whose influence extended far beyond anything Elias had imagined. Vivian Aldridge was the founder and CEO of Aldridge Technologies, a company that had revolutionized data security and artificial intelligence applications. Her personal wealth was estimated at over $2 billion, making her one of the 50 richest women in America, but the business success was only part of the story. As Elias clicked through article after article, a more complex narrative emerged. Vivienne had been married to Dr. Michael Aldridge, a prominent research scientist, until his death in a car accident 8 years earlier. They'd had a daughter, Emma, who had died of leukemia at the age of 10. The same year Vivienne had founded her company. The timeline painted a picture of a woman who had channeled profound grief into extraordinary professional achievement. Many of the articles mentioned her reputation for brilliant strategic thinking, combined with an almost reclusive lifestyle. She rarely gave interviews, avoided public speaking engagements, and was known for her intense privacy regarding personal matters. "She's been hurt," Mrs. Chen observed quietly, reading over his shoulder. "People don't become that successful and that private without experiencing significant loss." More recent articles revealed additional complexity. Vivienne's company had been the subject of a hostile takeover attempt the previous year, fought off only through a combination of legal maneuvering and what business journalists described as ruthless strategic thinking. Several board members had been replaced, and there were hints of ongoing internal conflicts over the company's direction. The final piece of the puzzle came in a profile from Forbes magazine, published just 6 months earlier. The article described Vivienne's growing interest in impact investing, using wealth to create positive social change rather than simply generating returns. She had funded several community development projects in rural areas, always with the same criteria: local leadership, sustainable economic models, and measurable benefits for residents. "Tommy, come look at this," Elias called as his son arrived. At the library after school, backpack slung over his shoulder and face bright with curiosity. Together, they studied the screen as Elias explained what he'd learned. Tommy listened with the serious attention he gave to subjects that mattered, asking questions that demonstrated both intelligence and emotional maturity. "So she's really rich, but she's also really sad," Tommy summarized. "And she wants to help people because helping makes her feel better about the sad stuff." The simplicity of his son's analysis cut straight to the heart of what Elias had spent hours trying to understand. Vivienne Aldridge was someone who had lost the people she loved most and was using her considerable resources to create meaning from that loss. Her offer to Millbrook wasn't charity. It was a form of healing, both for herself and for communities that reminded her of what she'd lost. That evening, they drove to the harbour, where the remains of the old fishing fleet bobbed at their moorings, like elderly relatives gathering for a reunion. The conversation with Tommy continued as they walked along the pier, father and son working through the implications of an opportunity that seemed to offer everything they needed. "What would Mom have said?" Tommy asked, as they sat on the weathered bench where Elias had once brought Sarah to watch the sunset during their courtship. It was the question Elias had been avoiding, though he'd felt Sarah's presence throughout, the day like a gentle pressure at the edge of his consciousness. She'd always been the optimistic one in their relationship, the person who saw possibilities where he saw problems, who encouraged him to take chances he would never have considered on his own. She would have said that sometimes good things happen to good people, he said finally, and that we shouldn't be so afraid of change that we miss opportunities to help others. "Do you think Mrs. Aldridge really wants to help? Or does she just feel guilty?" "Both, probably, but maybe that's okay. Maybe the best partnerships come from people who need each other for different reasons." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the harbour in shades of gold and pink, the same colours that had been reflecting off these waters when the town was young and prosperous. Elias could imagine the harbour filled with working boats again, could picture young people staying in Millbrook instead of leaving for opportunities elsewhere, could envision Tommy growing up in a place where dreams seemed achievable rather than foolish. But he could also imagine the ways such an ambitious project could fail, could visualize himself in over his head, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives without the experience or knowledge to make them wisely. The weight of responsibility felt almost physical, a pressure that made his chest tight and his breathing shallow. "Dad," Tommy said, his voice carrying the wisdom that had been emerging more frequently since his mother's death, "you're scared, terrified." Elias admitted, "But you're going to do it anyway, aren't you?" The question hung in the air between them, carried on the salt breeze that had been shaping conversations in this place for centuries. Elias thought about the wedding ring on his finger, about the promises he'd made to Sarah and the ones he'd made to Tommy, about the difference between safe choices and right choices. "I think I am," he said, "but not alone. If we do this, we do it together, you, me, and Mrs. Aldridge, and the whole town if they'll have us." Tommy's smile was bright enough to compete with the setting sun. "When do we start?" The question made Elias laugh, a sound of nervous excitement rather than humor. When did they start indeed? How did someone begin the process of transforming a dying town into something unprecedented? How did you bridge the gap between good intentions and practical reality? "I guess we start by calling Mrs. Aldridge and telling her we're interested in learning more." As they walked back to the truck, Elias felt a subtle shift in his perspective, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained over his life since Sarah's death. For 3 years, he'd focused on survival and stability, on protecting Tommy from further loss and maintaining the illusion that their small world was secure. But perhaps it was time to acknowledge that true security came not from avoiding risk, but from embracing opportunities to grow and contribute. The drive home took them past the elementary school where Tommy had learned to read, past the Methodist church, where Sarah's funeral had been held, past the small businesses that formed the backbone of Millbrook's struggling economy. Each landmark held memories and associations, but tonight they also seemed to hold possibilities, ways that new investment and energy could honor the past while building something better for the future. At home, Elias found the business card. Vivienne had left, its elegant simplicity reflecting the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. He stared at it for a long moment, understanding that the phone call he was about to make would change everything, would set in motion events that couldn't be undone or controlled. But as he reached for the phone, he felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had in months, a warmth that seemed to flow from the wedding ring on his finger directly to his heart. She'd always believed in taking chances, in trusting people who offered genuine help, in building something meaningful from whatever materials life provided. "Here goes nothing," he murmured, and dialed the number. The call to Vivienne had led to a series of meetings that transformed Elias's understanding of what ambitious planning could accomplish. Over the course of 2 weeks, their kitchen table had become an unlikely headquarters for project discussions, its surface covered with architectural drawings, demographic studies, and financial projections that made Tommy's homework seem refreshingly simple by comparison. Vivienne arrived each morning in increasingly modest vehicles, first the helicopter, then a luxury sedan, and finally a practical rental car that didn't draw stares from the neighbors. She seemed to be conducting her own experiment in blending into Millbrook's rhythms, trading designer suits for business casual attire that wouldn't look out of place at a town council meeting. "The key to successful community development," she explained during one of their sessions, spreading blueprints across the table while Tommy worked on algebra nearby, "is making sure the local population drives the process rather than simply receiving the benefits of outside investment." The innovation hub she envisioned was more complex and thoughtful than anything Elias had initially imagined. The facility would house not just technology startups, but also educational programs, community workshops, and support services for local entrepreneurs. The design included spaces for traditional skills like boat building and woodworking, alongside cutting-edge manufacturing equipment and computer labs. "It's not about importing Silicon Valley culture to Maine," Vivian continued, her finger tracing the outline of what would become the main building. It's about creating something new that honors both innovation and tradition. But as word of the project spread through Millbrook, the community's reaction proved more complicated than either Elias or Vivian had anticipated. The town's historical society, led by Eleanor Whitman, emerged as the center of organized resistance to what they termed unwanted development that threatens our character. Mrs. Whitman, a retired high school principal whose family had lived in Millbrook for 6 generations, had requested a meeting that Elias couldn't reasonably refuse. She arrived at his house on a crisp October morning, accompanied by Harold Fisher from the town council and Margaret Riley, who owned the largest bed and breakfast in town. "We're not against progress," Mrs. Whitman began, settling herself in Elias's living room with the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to. "But we've seen what happens when outside money comes in and changes everything. Bar Harbor used to be a real fishing village before the tourists took over. The comparison to Bar Harbor stung because it wasn't entirely unfair. The transformation of that coastal town from working community to upscale tourist destination had displaced many long-time residents, replacing authentic local culture with a sanitized version designed to appeal to visitors with disposable income. This is different," Elias said carefully. "The whole point is to create opportunities for people who already live here." "That's what they always say," Harold Fisher interjected. "But once the developers get involved, once property values start rising, working families get priced out. It's happened all over coastal Maine." Vivienne, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward with the intensity that marked her most serious moments. "What would you need to see to believe this project serves Millbrook's interests rather than exploiting them?" The question surprised the visitors, who had clearly come prepared for defensiveness rather than genuine inquiry. Mrs. Whitman consulted a folder she'd brought, its contents representing hours of research and community discussion. "Local hiring preferences for all positions," she read, "guaranteed affordable housing for workers, profit-sharing agreements that ensure the community benefits from any financial success, and decision-making authority that remains in local hands, not with outside investors." Rather than dismiss these demands as unrealistic, Vivian pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. "Those are reasonable requirements. What else?" The conversation continued for 2 hours, evolving from confrontation to negotiation, as Vivian demonstrated both willingness to compromise and genuine understanding of the community's concerns. By the time the visitors left, they had agreed to present the modified proposal to a broader community meeting, though their skepticism remained evident. "They don't trust me," Vivian observed after the door closed behind them. "They don't trust anyone with money," Elias corrected. "This town has been disappointed too many times by people who promised more than they delivered." The community meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening in the high school gymnasium, the only space large enough to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. As the date approached, Elias found himself caught between excitement and anxiety, understanding that the project's future would be determined by his neighbors' willingness to believe in possibilities they'd never previously considered. Tommy, meanwhile, had become an unofficial ambassador for the project among his classmates, returning from school each day with reports of conversations and questions that revealed how thoroughly the topic had penetrated local consciousness. "Jenny Martinez's dad wants to know if there will be jobs for people who don't have college degrees," he reported one afternoon, "and Mrs. Peterson asked if the project will make our property taxes go up." Each question represented legitimate concerns that required careful answers. Elias and Vivian spent their evenings preparing responses that were both honest and optimistic, acknowledging potential problems while emphasizing the safeguards they were building into the project structure. The evening before the community meeting, Vivian surprised Elias by asking to visit the old Aldrich Cannery, the abandoned building that had once been Millbrook's largest employer. They drove through the gathering dusk to the industrial waterfront, where the massive brick structure stood like a monument to better economic times. "My grandfather worked here during the summers when he was in college," Vivian said, as they walked through the empty parking lot. "He used to tell stories about the noise and the smell and the satisfaction of honest work." The building's windows were boarded up, but through gaps in the plywood they could see the cavernous interior where hundreds of people had once processed the day's catch. Rusted machinery sat where it had been abandoned when the last owner declared bankruptcy, and the concrete floors were stained with decades of salt water and fish oil. "This is what I want to prevent," Vivian continued, her voice carrying a mixture of sadness and determination. "Not just here, but in communities all over the country where economic change left people behind." For the first time since they'd begun working together, Elias glimpsed the personal motivation that drove Vivian's professional ambitions. She wasn't just seeking to invest money wisely or build a successful business. She was trying to repair something that had been broken, to restore the connection between work and community that had been severed by forces beyond local control. "My daughter would have been 16 this year," she said quietly. She loved visiting small towns, loved the way everyone knew each other's names and stories. She thought places like this were magic. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with grief and hope in equal measure. Elias understood now why Vivian had chosen Millbrook, why she was willing to invest so much energy in a place she'd discovered by accident. She was building something her daughter would have loved, creating opportunities for other people's children in communities that reminded her of everything she'd lost. "She would have been proud of what you're trying to do," Elias said. "I hope so. But first, we have to convince 300 skeptical Mainers that we're not just another group of wealthy outsiders with good intentions and bad execution." The challenge ahead of them was indeed formidable. Tomorrow evening, they would stand before friends and neighbors who had watched other promises evaporate, who had learned to distrust opportunities that seemed too good to be true. They would need to demonstrate not just the project's potential benefits, but also their own commitment to honoring the values and traditions that made Millbrook worth preserving. As they drove back through town, past houses where porch lights were beginning to flicker on against the approaching darkness, Elias felt the weight of representing something larger than his own family's future. The Innovation Hub had become a symbol of Millbrook's potential for renewal, but it had also become a test of the community's willingness to believe in itself. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said as they pulled into his driveway, "we'll have given people something to hope for. And if they say no?" Elias considered the question, understanding that rejection would mean more than just a failed business proposal. It would mean that fear had triumphed over possibility, that the community he loved had chosen decline over the uncertainty of change. "Then we'll respect their decision and find another way to help. But I don't think they'll say no. This town has been waiting for something to believe in for a long time." Inside the house, Tommy was waiting with hot chocolate and the kind of excitement that comes from being part of something important. Tomorrow would determine whether that excitement was justified, whether the partnership between a grieving widow and a struggling mechanic could indeed transform a dying town into something unprecedented. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome had never been less certain. The community meeting had been scheduled for 7 o'clock, but by 6:30 the high school gymnasium was already 3/4 full. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows, facing a makeshift stage where a podium waited beneath basketball hoops that had witnessed decades of local triumphs and defeats. The air hummed with conversation and anticipation, neighbors greeting each other with the mixture of curiosity and skepticism that accompanied any gathering promising to change their familiar world. Elias stood at the side entrance, watching people file in with the nervous energy of someone about to perform surgery on his own community. He recognized most of the faces: customers from the garage, parents from Tommy's school, fellow volunteers from the annual harbor cleanup. These were people whose trust he'd earned through years of reliable service. But tonight, he was asking them to follow him into territory none of them had explored. Vivienne arrived precisely at 5 minutes before 7, her entrance as carefully choreographed as everything else about her public appearances. She wore a simple navy blazer over dark slacks, no jewelry except for small pearl earrings that suggested understated elegance rather than ostentatious wealth. Her hair was pulled back in a style that looked professional but approachable, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to addressing hostile audiences. "Ready?" she asked, though her slightly pale complexion suggested she was feeling the pressure as much as Elias. "Ready as I'll ever be." The presentation began smoothly. Elias introduced the project's basic concepts, while Vivienne provided technical details and financial projections. They had rehearsed their remarks dozens of times, anticipating questions and preparing responses that balanced optimism with realistic assessments of challenges and timelines. The audience listened with the polite attention that characterized most town meetings, though Elias could sense undercurrents of excitement and concern in equal measure. Mrs. Whitman sat in the front row with her arms crossed, her expression suggesting continued skepticism despite their previous negotiations. Harold Fisher took notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen moving constantly as he tracked details he would later analyze and critique. But other faces showed growing interest. Pete Morrison, the lobsterman, leaned forward when they discussed maritime training programs. Maria Santos from the elementary school nodded approvingly at descriptions of educational opportunities for local children. Even some of the younger residents who had been planning to leave for jobs elsewhere seemed intrigued by the possibility of building careers without abandoning their hometown. They were 40 minutes into the presentation, fielding questions about environmental impact and construction timelines, when the gymnasium's main doors swung open with the dramatic flourish of a carefully planned entrance. 3 men in expensive suits strode down the center aisle, their synchronized movement and matching briefcases suggesting corporate precision rather than casual attendance. Vivienne's face went white when she saw them. The lead figure was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of boardroom battles. He walked directly to the front of the room, his companions flanking him like bodyguards, and addressed the crowd with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Richard Thornfield, and I serve as interim chairman of the Aldridge Technologies Board of Directors." The name meant nothing to most of the audience, but Elias watched Vivienne's composure crumble as if she'd been physically struck. Her hands began to tremble, and she gripped the podium's edges to steady herself. "I'm afraid Ms. Aldridge has not been entirely forthcoming about her current circumstances," Thornfield continued, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone delivering prepared remarks. 3 days ago, the board voted to remove her from all operational responsibilities, pending a comprehensive review of her decision-making capabilities. The gymnasium erupted in confused murmurs as people struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Elias felt the floor shifting beneath his feet, not just physically but metaphorically, as the partnership he'd believed in began to collapse in real time. Thornfield reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with legal documents. "Ms. Aldridge has been experiencing what our medical consultants have termed emotional instability and impaired judgment following her recent automobile accident. Her proposal to invest $50 million in this project is being cited as evidence of her unfitness to manage corporate resources." The words landed like physical blows. Elias watched 3 weeks of careful planning and growing hope dissolve into embarrassment and confusion. Around the gymnasium, faces that had been showing interest now reflected suspicion and disappointment. The familiar expression of people who had allowed themselves to believe in something too good to be true. The board has instructed me to inform this community that Aldridge Technologies will not be proceeding with any investments that have not received proper corporate approval, Thornfield concluded. We regret any inconvenience Ms. Aldridge's unauthorized promises may have caused. Vivian finally found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper that the microphone barely captured. You can't do this. The board doesn't have the authority. Actually, we do. Thornfield's smile was coldly professional. Your controlling interest in the company was placed in trust following the board's determination of incapacity. All major financial decisions now require board approval, which this project most certainly will not receive. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 people sat in stunned quiet as they processed the collapse of dreams that had barely begun to form. Elias felt the weight of their disappointment settling on his shoulders, the crushing responsibility of having led his neighbors toward a mirage that was now evaporating before their eyes. But as he looked at Vivian, at her obvious pain and humiliation, at the way she seemed to shrink under the weight of public exposure, something unexpected happened. Instead of anger or disappointment, he felt protective fury rise in his chest. This was the woman he had risked his life to save, who had offered her gratitude in the form of genuine opportunity for his community. Whatever corporate politics were playing out here, she didn't deserve to be ambushed and humiliated in front of strangers. Mr. Thornfield, Elias said, his voice cutting through the silence with the authority of someone speaking in his own hometown. I appreciate you coming all this way to share information with us, but this is our community meeting, and Ms. Aldridge is our invited guest. If you have business to conduct with her, I suggest you do it privately. The challenge was unmistakable, and Thornfield's expression revealed surprise at being confronted by someone he clearly considered irrelevant to corporate decision-making. Mr. Rayner, Elias Rayner, and you're disrupting our meeting. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Not necessarily support for the project, but recognition of basic courtesy and community solidarity. These were people who understood the importance of treating neighbors with respect, regardless of their circumstances. Thornfield's companions whispered urgently in his ear, clearly recommending retreat in the face of unexpected resistance. But the man's arrogance overrode tactical wisdom. Mr. Rayner, I understand your disappointment, but you need to understand that Ms. Aldridge has no authority to make commitments on behalf of our company. This entire presentation has been a waste of everyone's time. Maybe so, said a voice. From the crowd, Elias turned to see Pete Morrison standing up, his weathered face set in the stubborn expression that had carried him through 40 years of fishing in dangerous waters. But seems to me, a man who shows up uninvited to someone else's meeting and starts throwing around insults might not be the most reliable source of information either. Other voices joined in, a rumbling of discontent that suggested the community's famous resistance to outside interference was asserting itself. These were people whose ancestors had survived everything from British taxation to Great Depression, who had developed a healthy skepticism toward anyone claiming authority they hadn't earned. Mrs. Whitman, surprising everyone, stood and addressed Thornfield directly. Young man, I've been opposing this project since I first heard about it, but I oppose it on its merits, not because some corporate executives from away think they can come into our town and tell us what to think. The tide was turning. Elias realized whatever Thornfield had hoped to accomplish with his dramatic entrance was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of discrediting Vivian, he was uniting the community in defense of their right to make their own decisions. Furthermore, Mrs. Whitman continued, her retired educator's voice carrying easily to the back of the gymnasium. Anyone who would publicly humiliate a woman who nearly died in an automobile accident has questionable judgment of his own. The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, a sound that seemed to restore some color to Vivian's cheeks. She straightened at the podium, her composure beginning to return as she recognized the unexpected support surrounding her. Thornfield, finally recognizing that his strategy had failed, gathered his documents and prepared to leave. But before reaching the door, he turned back with a parting shot that revealed the true motivation behind his dramatic appearance. The board will remember this community's support for Ms. Aldridge's instability, he said. Don't expect any future consideration from Aldridge Technologies once proper management is restored. The threat was unmistakable, and it confirmed what Elias had begun to suspect. This wasn't really about Vivian's competence or the appropriateness of the Millbrook investment. This was about corporate control, about removing a CEO whose vision conflicted with board members' priorities. After Thornfield and his companions left, the meeting continued in a very different atmosphere. The community's protective response to the corporate ambush had created an unexpected bond with Vivian, transforming her from an outsider offering charity into a fellow victim of forces beyond local control. "So what happens now?" asked Maria Santos, her question echoing what everyone was thinking. Vivian looked out at the crowd, her voice stronger now but carrying the weight of uncertainty. "I don't know. The legal situation is complex, and I may not have the authority to proceed as I'd planned, but you still want to?" This from Tommy, who had been sitting in the front row watching the drama unfold with wide-eyed fascination. "Yes," Vivian said without hesitation, "more than ever." The meeting ended without resolution, but also without the defeat that Thornfield had intended to orchestrate. As people filed out, many stopped to offer Vivian words of support or encouragement, a gesture of community solidarity that seemed to surprise her with its genuineness. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked as they walked to their cars in the parking lot. "I'm thinking," Vivian replied, "that I may have underestimated both the board's ruthlessness and this community's loyalty, and I'm thinking that I need to decide whether I'm going to fight for what I believe in or accept defeat gracefully." "And which way are you leaning?" Her smile was the first genuine expression of happiness he'd seen from her all evening. "Mr. Rayner, I didn't build a $2 billion company by accepting defeat gracefully." As they drove home through Millbrook's quiet streets, Elias reflected on how completely the evening had changed their circumstances. 3 hours ago, they had been partners in an ambitious but straightforward development project. Now they were allies in a battle whose scope and stakes they were only beginning to understand. The corporate takeover. Documents that Thornfield had brandished weren't just legal papers. They were a declaration of war against everything Vivian had tried to build, both in her company and in her life. And somehow, inexplicably, a small coastal town in Maine had become the battlefield where that war would be decided. The morning after the community meeting dawned grey and cold, as if the weather itself were reflecting the uncertainty that had settled over Millbrook like fog. Elias found Vivian sitting in her rental car outside his house at 7 a.m., staring at her phone with the expression of someone receiving very bad news in real time. He tapped on her window, and she rolled it down to reveal eyes that were red-rimmed from either lack of sleep or recent tears. Possibly both. "Legal called," she said without preamble. "The board filed a formal competency challenge yesterday evening. They're demanding a psychiatric evaluation and threatening to freeze all my assets pending the outcome." The words hit Elias like physical blows. He'd known that corporate politics could be brutal, but the speed and precision of the attack suggested planning that went far beyond spontaneous concern for Vivian's judgment. Can they do that? They can try. Whether they'll succeed depends on factors I can't control: which judges are assigned, which experts they hire, how effectively my lawyers can counter their narrative. She gestured at her phone, which had been buzzing constantly with incoming calls. "Half of these are from reporters. Somehow the business press already knows about the board action." Tommy appeared at the front door in his pajamas, drawn by the unusual sight of an early morning visitor. His presence seemed to remind Vivian that their partnership extended beyond corporate maneuvering to real people with genuine stakes in the outcome. "Come inside," Elias said. "We'll figure this out together." Over coffee and breakfast, they began to understand the scope of the challenge they faced. Vivian's lawyers were optimistic about eventually overturning the board's action, but legal proceedings could take months or even years. Meanwhile, the Millbrook project would remain in limbo, neither officially cancelled nor able to proceed. "There's another complication," Vivian admitted, as Tommy left for school with a hug that seemed designed to provide encouragement rather than receive it. "The board isn't just questioning this project. They're using it as evidence of a pattern of what they call irrational decision-making." She pulled out a folder containing documents that painted a picture of systematic undermining that had been building for months. Board meeting minutes showed increasing resistance to her community investment initiatives. Email chains revealed careful documentation of every decision that could be characterized as emotionally driven rather than profit-focused. Personnel files suggested that several key executives had been building cases for her removal long before. The automobile accident provided convenient justification. This wasn't about the crash, Elias realized. They were planning this anyway. The crash gave them a timeline and a narrative. Grieving CEO makes irrational decisions following traumatic experience. It's a story that writes itself, and it's probably true enough to be believable. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to fully examine. Was the Millbrook project actually the product of impaired judgment? Had Vivienne's gratitude and grief combined to create an opportunity that was more therapy than sound business planning? But before those doubts could take root, Tommy's voice echoed from the kitchen where he was gathering his school supplies. "Dad, someone's here!" Through the window, they could see a small delegation approaching the house. Mrs. Whitman, Pete Morrison, and Maria Santos, moving with the purposeful stride of people on a mission. They'd clearly coordinated their visit, probably communicating through the informal network that carried information through Millbrook faster than any official news source. "We've been talking," Mrs. Whitman announced when Elias opened the door, "about last night, about what that corporate man said, about what it means for our community." They settled in the living room, the same space where Vivienne had first outlined her vision for the innovation hub. But this conversation had a different energy. Not the tentative exploration of possibilities, but the determined planning of people who had decided to take action. "First thing," Pete Morrison said, "we want you to know that most folks didn't appreciate outsiders coming into our town and trying to tell us what to think. Made a lot of people more supportive of your project, not less." "Second thing," Maria Santos continued, "we've been doing some research of our own. Turns out Ms. Aldridge's company has a pretty good reputation for treating workers fairly and investing in community development. Can't say the same for some of the board members who are trying to remove her." Mrs. Whitman pulled out a manila folder that looked suspiciously similar to the ones Vivienne had been carrying. "Harold Fisher's been busy with his computer. Seems several of those board members have connections to companies that strip mine community assets for short-term profits. One of them was involved in closing the paper mill up in Calais, put 400 people out of work and left the town to die." The revelation shifted the entire context of the previous evening's confrontation. This wasn't just about Vivienne's competence or the appropriateness of the Millbrook investment. It was about competing visions of what corporations should do with their wealth and power. "We can't help you fight your legal battles," Mrs. Whitman continued, "but we can help you fight the public relations war. If your board wants to use this community as evidence of poor judgment, they're going to discover that this community has opinions of its own." What followed was the most remarkable display of organizational efficiency Elias had ever witnessed outside of military service. Within hours, the informal network that governed Millbrook's social and economic life had mobilized. With military precision, phone calls were made, meetings arranged, and strategies developed with the speed that comes from people who understand both their own capabilities and the stakes involved. By afternoon, a petition supporting the Innovation Hub was circulating through every business and household in town. The document, drafted by Mrs. Whitman, with the precision of someone who had spent decades teaching students to write persuasively, made a compelling case for the project's benefits while explicitly rejecting outside interference in local decision-making. We, the residents of Millbrook, Maine, hereby express our strong support for the Aldridge Technologies Innovation Hub as proposed by Ms. Vivian Aldridge, the petition read. We further reject any attempt by corporate executives to characterize our community's enthusiasm for economic development as evidence of poor judgment by project sponsors. The language was careful but unmistakable, a declaration of independence from corporate authority that drew on deep traditions of Maine resistance to outside control. By evening, nearly 800 signatures had been collected, representing virtually every adult resident of the town and surrounding area. Tommy, meanwhile, had become an unofficial coordinator for his generation's response to the crisis. His school project about the Innovation Hub had evolved into something resembling a campaign, complete with hand-drawn maps showing how the facility would integrate with existing community assets and carefully researched arguments about the economic benefits of technology education. Mrs. Peterson says we can present our project to the school board next week, he reported over dinner. And Marcus's mom thinks we should send copies to the newspaper and maybe some of the TV stations. The suggestion sparked an idea that had been forming in Elias's mind throughout the day. What if we invited the media here, showed them what this community is really like, let them see for themselves whether supporting our project represents good judgment or poor judgment? Vivienne looked up from the legal documents she'd been reviewing. That's risky. Media attention could backfire if the coverage focuses on corporate drama rather than community benefits. Or it could demonstrate that you're not some unstable executive making irrational decisions, but someone who's found a community worth investing in. The conversation continued late into the evening, evolving from defensive planning to proactive strategy. They were no longer simply hoping to survive the board's attack. They were preparing to use that attack as an opportunity to demonstrate the value of the very approach the board was trying to discredit. There's something else, Vivienne said. As the evening wound down, my lawyers think the board overplayed their hand last night. Coming here, making public statements about my competence, it creates a paper trail that could work in our favor if we can demonstrate that their real motivation is control rather than concern. How do we do that? By succeeding, by showing that this project isn't the product of impaired judgment, but of vision that extends beyond quarterly profit reports. She looked around the room, taking in the comfortable domesticity that had become the unlikely headquarters for their ambitious plans. By proving that sometimes the best business decisions are the ones that other business people think are crazy. The plan that emerged over the following days was audacious in its simplicity. They would proceed with the Innovation Hub as if the board challenge didn't exist, organizing community support and media attention that would make cancelling the project politically and economically difficult. If Vivian's corporate authority was in question, they would demonstrate that the project had developed momentum beyond any individual's control. The petition drive expanded into a letter-writing campaign that reached beyond Millbrook to other Maine communities facing similar economic challenges. Local newspapers picked up the story, framing it as a David and Goliath battle between corporate greed and community self-determination. Within a week, the story had attracted regional and eventually national attention, but the most powerful weapon in their arsenal proved to be something none of them had anticipated: the simple authenticity of a community that had found something worth fighting for. Television interviews with longtime residents revealed not desperation or gullibility, but thoughtful people who had carefully considered their options and chosen to believe in themselves. "We're not asking for a handout," Pete Morrison told a reporter from the Portland Press-Herald. "We're asking for a partnership with someone who understands that healthy communities are good for business. If that's poor judgment, then I guess we're all crazy." As the decisive board meeting approached, scheduled for the following Monday in Boston, Elias found himself simultaneously exhausted and energized by the campaign they'd mounted. Win or lose, they had demonstrated something important about the power of community solidarity and the value of fighting for principles rather than simply accepting defeat. But late at night, when the phone calls ended and the strategy sessions concluded, he still wondered whether they were fighting for something real or something that existed only in their collective imagination. The line between vision and delusion was thinner than he'd realized, and the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined possible. The wedding ring on his finger caught the lamplight as he turned the pages of Tommy's math homework, checking problems that seemed refreshingly concrete compared to the complex equations of corporate politics and community development. Whatever happened on Monday, he knew that their lives had been permanently changed by the simple act of believing that good things were possible. Now they would discover whether that belief was justified or whether it would join the long list of Maine dreams that had foundered on the rocks of economic reality. The Aldridge Technologies headquarters occupied 37 floors of a glass tower in Boston's financial district, its sleek facade reflecting the harbor where cargo ships moved with the same purposeful efficiency that had once characterized Millbrook's fishing fleet. Elias stood on the sidewalk outside the building at 8:30 Monday morning, feeling as out of place as a lobster boat in a marina full of yachts. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but Vivian had asked him to arrive early for final preparations. She'd been staying in the city since Friday, working with her legal team to prepare arguments that would either restore her authority or confirm her removal from the company she'd built from nothing. The elevator ride to the 34th floor felt like ascending through layers of wealth and power that Elias had never imagined. Each floor they passed represented resources that could transform communities like Millbrook or destroy them, depending on the decisions made in boardrooms like the one he was about to enter. Vivian met him at the elevator doors, wearing a charcoal grey suit that managed to convey both professional authority and personal vulnerability. Her hair was pulled back in a style that suggested confidence, but Elias could see the tension in her shoulders and the carefully controlled worry in her eyes. "How are you feeling?" she asked as they walked toward the conference room. "Like I'm about to perform surgery with a wrench," Elias admitted. "How are you feeling? Like I'm about to find out whether the last 10 years of my life have been building something real or just an expensive illusion." The conference room was intimidating in its understated elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor, a mahogany table that could seat 20 people, leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. But what struck Elias most forcefully was the emotional coldness of the space, the complete absence of anything that suggested human warmth or community connection. Richard Thornfield was already present, flanked by 2 other board members and a small army of lawyers and consultants. He nodded coldly to Vivian, but ignored Elias entirely, a dismissal that felt both deliberate and revealing. "Ms. Aldridge," Thornfield began as soon as they were seated, "I trust you've used the weekend to reconsider your position regarding the board's concerns." "I've used the weekend to gather additional support for the Millbrook project," Vivian replied evenly, "which I believe addresses those concerns quite effectively." She gestured to Elias, who stood and approached the presentation area with the careful movements of someone who had never addressed a corporate board, but understood the importance of appearing confident despite his inexperience. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the same steady authority he used when explaining complex mechanical problems to customers. "My name is Elias Rayner, and I'm here representing the Millbrook community in support of Ms. Aldridge's Innovation Hub proposal." The presentation he'd prepared was deliberately simple, focusing on concrete benefits rather than abstract business theory. He spoke about unemployment rates and population decline, about young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere, about the slow death of communities that had once thrived on industries that no longer existed. "This isn't about charity," he continued, clicking through slides that showed demographic data and economic projections. "It's about recognizing that sustainable business success requires healthy communities, and healthy communities require investment in people and infrastructure." He could see skepticism in the board members' faces, the polite dismissiveness of people who were accustomed to reducing complex social problems to simplified financial equations. But he pressed on, drawing on every conversation he'd had with neighbors and every observation he'd made about what made communities thrive or fail. "Ms. Aldridge isn't making an emotional decision based on gratitude," he said, reaching the core of his argument. "She's making a strategic decision based on understanding something that many business leaders miss, that long-term profitability requires investment in the social and economic infrastructure that makes business possible." The room was quiet. When he finished, the kind of silence that could indicate either thoughtful consideration or polite preparation for dismissal. Thornfield consulted his notes before responding, his tone suggesting barely controlled impatience. "Mr. Rayner, we appreciate your community's enthusiasm, but business decisions can't be made based on good intentions and local support. They require rigorous analysis of risk, return on investment, and strategic alignment with corporate objectives." "I understand that," Elias replied, "which is why I'd like to share some additional information about our community's response to this project." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew the petition that had been circulating through Millbrook, now containing over 800 signatures. But more importantly, he pulled out a folder containing letters of support from regional businesses, economic development agencies, and community organizations throughout coastal Maine. "This isn't just about one town or one project," he explained, distributing copies around the table. "It's about a model for community development that other organizations are already interested in replicating. The Maine Department of Economic Development has indicated they would fast-track permitting for similar projects. The University of Maine wants to establish a research partnership. 3 other coastal communities have requested feasibility studies for their own innovation hubs." The impact was immediate and visible. Board members who had been sitting back in their chairs leaned forward to examine the documents. Thornfield's expression shifted from dismissive confidence to something approaching concern. "Furthermore," Elias continued, "the media attention surrounding this project has generated interest from potential clients and partners who see Aldridge Technologies as a company that understands the connection between business success and community development. That's not poor judgment, that's market positioning that your competitors would love to achieve." Vivienne had been watching the board members' reactions with the keen attention of someone who had spent years reading corporate body language. Now she stood and moved to the presentation area, her confidence visibly returning as she recognized the shift in the room's dynamics. "The Millbrook project represents exactly the kind of innovation that has driven this company's success from the beginning," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had built a $2 billion enterprise. "We've always succeeded by identifying opportunities that others overlooked, by understanding that the best investments are often the ones that seem unconventional at first glance." She clicked to a new slide showing financial projections that extended far beyond the initial Millbrook investment. "This isn't just about one community development project. It's about establishing Aldridge Technologies as the leader in sustainable community business partnerships, a market that's projected to grow by 40% over the next 5 years. The transformation was remarkable. Arguments that had seemed emotional and impractical when framed as charity began to look visionary and profitable when presented as business strategy. The same facts, viewed through a different lens, told a completely different story about judgment and competence, but just as the momentum seemed to be shifting in their favor, Tommy's voice echoed from the conference room's speaker system. "Ms. Aldridge, this is Tommy Rayner calling from Millbrook Elementary School." The interruption was so unexpected that everyone in the room froze. Somehow, Tommy had managed to conference call into the board meeting, his 12-year-old voice carrying clearly through the sophisticated audio system. "Tommy," Vivian said, her surprise evident, "how did you, Mrs. Peterson, help me figure out the conference call number from your business card? I hope it's okay, but I wanted to tell the board members something important about our project." Thornfield was already reaching for the phone to disconnect the call, but several other board members gestured for him to wait. There was something compelling about the unexpected intervention, a human element that cut through the corporate formality that had dominated the morning. "Go ahead, Tommy," Vivian said, settling back in her chair with an expression that mixed amusement with genuine curiosity about what her youngest advocate might say. "I made a map," Tommy announced, his voice carrying the earnest enthusiasm that characterized his approach to school projects. "It shows how the Innovation Hub connects to everything else in our town: the harbor, the school, the library, the places where people work and live." The conference room's large screen flickered to life, displaying what appeared to be a child's hand-drawn map, colored with crayons and markers. But despite its amateur execution, the drawing revealed a sophisticated understanding of community planning and economic development. "See, the Innovation Hub isn't separate from our town," Tommy continued, his explanation accompanied by what sounded like pointing at his original map. "It's part of everything we already have. The boat builders can use the new equipment to make better boats. The kids can learn about computers and engineering. The grown-ups who lost their jobs can learn new skills." The simplicity of the presentation was disarming. After hours of corporate jargon and financial projections, Tommy's straightforward explanation of community benefits cut directly to the heart of what the project was designed to accomplish. "My dad says that good businesses help the places where they operate," Tommy concluded, "and Ms. Aldridge wants to help our place. That doesn't sound like poor judgment to me. That sounds like the kind of person you'd want running your company." The silence that followed Tommy's presentation was profound, broken only by the soft hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of harbor traffic 34 floors below. Board members who had been preparing to vote for Vivian's removal were now studying a 12-year-old's crayon map with the intensity of people encountering an unexpected truth. "Thank you, Tommy," Vivian said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "That was exactly what we needed to hear." As the call ended, Elias looked around the conference room and saw something he hadn't expected: doubt in the faces of people who had seemed absolutely certain of their position just minutes earlier. Tommy's intervention had accomplished what hours of professional presentation couldn't achieve. It had reminded everyone present that business decisions affected real people in real communities, and that sometimes the simplest explanations were the most compelling. The momentum had shifted again, but the final outcome remained uncertain. Everything now depended on whether a corporate board could see past quarterly profit reports to embrace a vision that honored both business success and community development. The board's deliberation lasted 47 minutes, though to Elias it felt like hours. He and Vivian waited in a smaller conference room down the hall, watching boats move through Boston Harbor while the future of everything they'd worked toward was decided by people who had never set foot in Millbrook. Vivian sat with her hands folded in her lap, the picture of composed professionalism. but Elias could see the tension in the way she held her shoulders and the occasional flicker of uncertainty that crossed her face. They'd presented their case as effectively as possible, but corporate decisions often had more to do with internal politics than external merit. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I want you to know that working with you and your community has been the most meaningful thing I've done since Emma died." The admission carried weight beyond its simple words. Elias understood that for Vivian, the Millbrook project had become more than business strategy or even community development. It had become a way of honoring her daughter's memory by creating the kind of place Emma would have loved. "And I want you to know," he replied, "that you've given us something we hadn't had in years, hope, not just for economic recovery, but for believing that good things are still possible." A soft knock on the conference room door interrupted their conversation. Richard Thornfield's assistant, a young woman who had maintained careful neutrality throughout the morning's proceedings, opened the door with an expression that revealed nothing about the board's decision. "They're ready for you," she said simply. The walk back to the main conference room felt like a condemned man's final march, each step carrying them closer to a verdict that would determine not just their personal futures, but the trajectory of an entire community's development. Elias found himself thinking about Tommy, probably sitting in math class at that moment, unaware that his spontaneous conference call might have changed everything. The board members' faces were unreadable as Elias and Vivian took their seats. Thornfield consulted his notes with the deliberate movements of someone who had delivered many difficult decisions over the years, his expression suggesting neither triumph nor defeat. "Ms. Aldridge," he began, his voice carrying the formal tone that characterized all official corporate communications, "the board has completed its review of your proposal and the circumstances surrounding recent events." The pause that followed seemed to stretch indefinitely, filled with the weight of possibilities that could transform or destroy everything they'd worked toward. "After extensive discussion, we have reached several conclusions," Thornfield continued. "First, regarding the question of your fitness to serve as CEO of this company." Vivian's hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap, but her expression remained composed, the picture of someone prepared to accept whatever judgment was rendered. "The board acknowledges that your recent decisions, while unconventional, demonstrate strategic thinking that aligns with emerging market trends in corporate social responsibility and community-based development." The words came out carefully, as if Thornfield were reading from a script he didn't entirely agree with. "Your proposal for the Millbrook Innovation Hub, when viewed in the context of potential replication and market positioning, represents sound business planning rather than impaired judgment." Relief flooded through Elias like a physical sensation, though he tried to maintain his composure. But the formal language suggested there were still conditions and complications ahead. "However," Thornfield continued, and Elias felt his optimism falter, "the board has concerns about the scope and timeline of your proposed investment. $50 million represents a significant commitment that requires additional oversight and risk management protocols." Here it came, the compromise that would gut the project while technically approving it, the kind of corporate maneuvering that killed innovation through bureaucratic suffocation. "Therefore," Thornfield said, reaching for a document that had been prepared during the deliberation, "the board proposes the following modified approach to the Millbrook project." The terms were more complex than Elias had anticipated, but also more generous than he dared hope. The Innovation Hub would proceed as planned, but with staged funding that allowed for evaluation and adjustment at each phase. Vivienne would retain full authority over the project, but with additional board oversight for expenditures exceeding certain thresholds. "Furthermore," Thornfield continued, "the board recognizes the potential for replicating this model in other communities and authorizes the establishment of a dedicated community development division within Aldridge Technologies, with Ms. Aldridge as its executive director. The transformation was remarkable. What had begun as an attack on Vivian's competence had evolved into official corporate endorsement of the very vision the board had initially opposed. Tommy's innocent intervention and the community's passionate support had somehow converted skeptics into allies, but the most significant change was in Thornfield himself. The arrogant certainty that had characterized his earlier presentations had been replaced by something resembling respect, as if he'd been forced to acknowledge qualities in Vivian that he'd previously overlooked. "Ms. Aldridge," he said, setting aside his formal notes and speaking with unexpected personal warmth, "I owe you an apology. This board, myself included, allowed concern about quarterly performance to overshadow appreciation for the kind of long-term thinking that built this company's success." Vivian accepted the apology with grace, though Elias could see that the morning's emotional roller coaster had left her drained despite the positive outcome. "There is one additional condition," Thornfield added, turning his attention to Elias. "Mr. Rayner, the board would like to formalize your role as community liaison for this project and any future community development initiatives. Your presentation today demonstrated exactly the kind of local knowledge and authentic representation that corporate community partnerships require." The offer was unexpected and overwhelming. Elias had entered the morning as a struggling mechanic supporting a friend's business proposal. He was leaving as the official representative of his community in a partnership that could transform the economic landscape of coastal Maine. "I'm honored," he said, though the words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what was being offered. "But I want to be clear about one thing. Any role I play in this project has to serve Millbrook's interests first and corporate interests second." "Understood and agreed," Thornfield replied, without hesitation. "That's exactly why your involvement is essential." The signing of the partnership agreement took another hour, with lawyers reviewing language and executives clarifying responsibilities. But the emotional work was already complete. The transformation of adversaries into allies, the conversion of skepticism into support, the evolution of a rescue into a partnership. As they prepared to leave the building, Vivian paused at the elevator bank and looked back at the conference room where their future had been decided. "Emma would have loved this," she said quietly. "She always believed that grown-ups could work together to make things better if they just tried hard enough." The elevator ride down felt completely different from the morning's ascent. Instead of climbing toward judgment, they were descending toward implementation, carrying with them not just approval but enthusiasm for a project that had grown beyond their original vision. Outside on the sidewalk, Boston's financial district hummed with its usual energy, but Elias saw it differently. Now, the towers that had seemed intimidating that morning now looked like what they actually were, places where people made decisions that affected other people, where human judgment and corporate responsibility intersected in ways that could create enormous positive change. His phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. "Dad, did we win?" The question made him smile. Yes, they had won, but in ways none of them had anticipated. They'd won approval for their project, but more importantly, they'd won recognition that communities and corporations could be partners rather than adversaries, that business success and social responsibility were complementary rather than competing objectives. As they walked toward the harbor where Vivian's car was parked, Elias felt the weight of Sarah's wedding ring on his finger, not the heavy burden of grief it had become over the past 3 years, but the lighter pressure of love that endured and inspired rather than constrained. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now we go home and start building something unprecedented," Vivian replied. "Now we prove that this morning's vote was the beginning of something important rather than the end of something difficult." The drive back to Millbrook took them through the same countryside they'd traveled many times over the past month, but the landscape looked different now, not like territory between two separate worlds, but like the foundation for something. new that honored both tradition and innovation. By the time they reached the town limits, word of their success had already spread through the informal communication network that connected every household in Millbrook. Cars honked as they passed, neighbors waved from their porches, and the elementary school's electronic sign displayed a message that made both of them laugh. "Congratulations, Mr. Rayner and Ms. Aldridge. Millbrook believes in you too." The future was no longer a question mark. It was a construction project, a community development initiative, and most importantly, a partnership between people who had discovered that the best solutions often came from the most unlikely collaborations. 6 months later, Elias stood at his kitchen window, watching the morning fog lift from the harbor. But everything about the ritual had changed. The coffee in his hands came from a matching set of mugs, one his familiar chipped ceramic companion, the other a gift from Vivian that had gradually earned its place in their morning routine. The view through the window now included construction cranes and work vehicles, the skeletal framework of the innovation hub rising where the old Aldrich cannery had once stood. Tommy's voice carried from the kitchen table where he was finishing breakfast and reviewing notes for his presentation to the regional science fair. At 13, he had grown 3 inches and gained a confidence that came from being part of something larger than himself. His project on sustainable technology applications had attracted attention from universities that had once seemed impossibly distant. "Dad, Mrs. Aldridge is here," Tommy called, using the formal address that had evolved into a term of respectful affection. Through the window, Elias could see Vivian walking up the path with the measured stride of someone who had found her place in the world's rhythms. She'd been staying in Millbrook more often than Boston lately, renting a small cottage near the harbor while maintaining her corporate responsibilities through a combination of technology and careful delegation. The partnership agreement had exceeded everyone's expectations. The Innovation Hub's first phase was ahead of schedule and under budget, employing 47 local residents in construction jobs that paid better than anything available in the region. The educational programs had attracted students from 3 counties, and early partnerships with regional businesses suggested that job creation projections had been conservative rather than optimistic. But the changes went beyond economics. Millbrook had rediscovered something it had lost during the decades of decline, a sense of possibility that attracted new residents and convinced young people to stay rather than seek opportunities elsewhere. The harbor that had once hosted a few struggling lobster boats now accommodated pleasure craft and research vessels from the university's marine science program. "Morning," Vivian said as she entered the kitchen, accepting the second mug with the easy familiarity of someone who had become part of the household's daily rhythms. Her transformation over the past months had been as dramatic as the town's. The corporate armor of expensive suits and careful composure had been replaced by practical clothes and genuine warmth. "How's the Boston situation?" Elias asked, referring to the quarterly board meeting she'd attended the previous day. Thornfield actually complimented the quarterly returns from our community development division, said it was the fastest growing segment of the company's portfolio. She smiled at the irony. Apparently, being emotionally unstable is highly profitable. When it results in 40% annual growth, the morning conversation had become their planning time, a review of the day's priorities and challenges. Construction decisions needed approval, community concerns required attention, and the constant stream of visitors from other communities interested in replicating their model demanded coordination. Tommy gathered his school supplies and paused at the door with the ritual question that had replaced their old discussions about money troubles. "What can I help with today?" "Your science fair presentation is this afternoon," Vivian reminded him. "That's your only job today." "But I could stop by the hub after school, check on the computer lab setup." The boy's enthusiasm for the project had never waned, and his unofficial role as youth ambassador had proved invaluable in bridging generational gaps within the community. His perspective had influenced everything from facility design to program development. After Tommy left for school, Elias and Vivian drove to the construction site in her modest sedan, the practical vehicle she'd chosen to replace the corporate limousine that had been destroyed in the accident that brought them together. The morning tour had become their shared ritual, a way of marking progress and identifying problems before they became serious. The Innovation Hub was beginning to look like the vision they'd presented to the board 6 months earlier. The main building's glass and steel structure reflected traditional maritime architecture while incorporating cutting-edge environmental systems. Solar panels covered the roof, geothermal systems provided heating and cooling, and rain collection systems reduced water consumption by 60%. Mr. Rayner, Ms. Aldridge, called Maria Santos, who had left her teaching job to become the Hub's education coordinator. The University of Maine team is here for the research lab inspection. The morning dissolved into a series of meetings and decisions that had become the substance of Elias's new professional life. His role as community liaison had evolved into something resembling project management, requiring skills he'd never imagined needing, but had somehow developed through necessity and mentorship. By lunch, they had resolved 3 construction issues, approved 2 new partnership agreements, and reviewed applications for the fall semester's certification programs. The pace was demanding but energizing, the kind of meaningful work that made long days feel like accomplishments rather than endurance tests. Lunch at Miller's Deli, Vivian suggested, referring to the establishment that had become their informal office for discussions that required privacy. The walk through downtown Millbrook provided a different kind of progress report. Storefronts that had been empty for years now housed new businesses, attracted by the Hub's economic activity. The hardware store had expanded, the bookshop had reopened, and 3 new restaurants served the construction workers and visiting professionals who were becoming part of the town's daily life. At Miller's Deli, they found their usual corner table, occupied by Pete Morrison and Harold Fisher, who were engaged in animated discussion about lobster boat modifications that could incorporate hybrid propulsion systems. The conversation was typical of the innovative thinking that had begun to characterize Millbrook's approach to traditional industries. "How's the boat project progressing?" Elias asked as they joined the conversation. "Better than expected," Pete replied. "Turns out combining old knowledge with new technology isn't as difficult as we thought. The university's marine engineering students have some interesting ideas about efficiency improvements." The collaboration between traditional industries and technological innovation had emerged as one of the Hub's most successful initiatives, creating hybrid approaches that honored historical knowledge while embracing beneficial changes. After lunch, they returned to the Hub for the afternoon's scheduled community meeting, a weekly gathering that had replaced the monthly town meetings as the primary forum for local decision-making. The sessions were well attended and surprisingly efficient, possibly because people felt genuinely invested in outcomes rather than simply enduring bureaucratic procedures. "First item," Mrs. Whitman announced from her position as volunteer coordinator, "housing for the new families moving to town. We have 17 inquiries about rentals and only 3 available properties. The housing shortage was a good problem to have, but still a problem that required creative solutions. Discussion ranged from zoning modifications to encourage new construction to partnerships with regional developers who understood the community's vision. Second item," she continued, "the Regional Education Consortium wants to establish a satellite campus here. They're offering programs in marine biology, sustainable technology, and small business management. The proposal represented validation of their model success, but also raised questions about maintaining community character while accommodating growth. The debate was thoughtful and respectful, reflecting the trust that had developed through months of collaborative decision-making. As the meeting concluded, Elias reflected on how dramatically these gatherings differed from the contentious town. Meetings of earlier years. Success had bred cooperation, and cooperation had bred more success, creating a positive feedback loop that seemed to strengthen with each passing month. Evening brought Tommy's science fair presentation, held in the high school gymnasium, where the community meeting had taken place 6 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same space that had witnessed corporate confrontation now celebrated student achievement and community pride. Tommy's project had evolved into a comprehensive study of renewable energy applications for coastal communities, incorporating data from the Innovation Hub's environmental systems and projections for regional implementation. His presentation was confident and well-researched, drawing on knowledge he'd gained through daily exposure to cutting-edge technology and expert mentorship. In conclusion, he said, addressing an audience that included university professors and regional officials alongside proud neighbors, sustainable technology isn't just about protecting the environment. It's about creating economic opportunities that help communities thrive while preserving what makes them special. The applause was enthusiastic and sustained, recognition not just of Tommy's individual achievement, but of the collaborative effort that had made such opportunities possible. Watching his son accept congratulations from professors who were already discussing scholarship possibilities, Elias felt the profound satisfaction of seeing dreams transformed into reality. Later that evening, as the excitement of the science fair wound down, Elias and Vivienne found themselves alone on the harbour, pier where he'd brought Sarah years earlier. The same bench, the same view, but everything else had changed in ways that honoured the past while embracing the future. Regrets? Vivienne asked, the question covering territory they'd discussed many times over the past months. About the project? None. About anything else? He paused, considering the complex emotions that had accompanied their partnership's evolution into something deeper. Sarah would have liked you. She would have approved of what we've built together. The admission represented months of internal struggle over the guilt of moving beyond grief, of allowing new relationships to develop without feeling disloyal to sacred memories. The wedding ring still graced his finger, but its weight had changed, from burden to blessing, from constraint to connection. And Emma would have loved Tommy, Vivienne replied. She would have been proud to see young people like him having opportunities to stay in communities they love. They sat in comfortable silence, watching lights begin to twinkle across the harbour as fishing boats prepared for dawn departures and pleasure craft settled into evening moorings. The scene looked prosperous and peaceful, a community that had found sustainable ways to honour its heritage while adapting to changing economic realities. What's next? Elias asked, the question covering both immediate plans and long-term dreams. Next, we prove that this model can work anywhere communities are willing to believe in themselves, Vivienne said. We've got inquiries from 12 other towns, 3 university research partnerships, and a documentary crew that wants to film our story. The success had indeed attracted attention beyond their expectations. Validation that their hybrid approach to community development addressed needs that existed throughout rural America. But fame brought its own challenges, including pressure to expand faster than wisdom recommended. And personally, he asked, the question carrying implications they'd been approaching gradually over recent months. Personally, I think I've found something I'd been looking for without knowing I was searching, she replied. Community, purpose, partnership, all the things that money can't buy, but that make wealth meaningful. The conversation continued as they walked back through town, past the construction site where security lights illuminated the Innovation Hub's emerging structure, past the elementary school where Tommy had learned to dream big, past the Methodist church where Sarah's memory was honored and cherished. At Elias's front door, They paused in the pool of light from the porch lamp, two people who had discovered that the best partnerships often emerged from the most unexpected circumstances. "Same. Time tomorrow?" Vivian asked, referring to their morning ritual of coffee and planning. "Wouldn't miss it," Elias replied, understanding that the question covered much more than business schedules. Inside the house, he found Tommy asleep over his homework, exhausted by the day's excitement, but wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had exceeded his own expectations. Elias covered his son with a blanket and turned off the desk lamp, leaving only the gentle glow from the kitchen, where Sarah's mug waited beside its newer companion. The morning ritual would continue, but with the quiet addition of hope to its familiar comfort. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but also the confidence that came from building something meaningful in partnership with people who shared common values and complementary strengths. Outside, Millbrook settled into its nightly rhythms, a community that had learned to believe in itself again through the simple act of helping others do the same. The harbor reflected stars and streetlights in equal measure, ancient light and human illumination combining to guide the way forward into whatever possibilities tomorrow might bring.